Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our webcast on practical considerations for implementing drug serialisation. Today we're going to be looking at some of the, as the name suggests, practical considerations of what's required when looking at implementing drug serialisation in a pharmaceutical company, and specifically what's required in terms of integrating business processes and systems, as well as some of the underlying technology. My name's David Stokes, and I'm Global Lead for Life Sciences for Percipient. I've got just over 30 years experience now in life sciences. I originally started as a process control engineer, so strong manufacturing background, supply chain background, but also over the last 15 years or so been focusing much more on broader issues of regulatory compliance, and that includes looking at computer system validation, more recently on enterprise systems. Been involved a number of times now in helping to develop requirements for drug serialisation and pedigree solutions. So that's the actual software systems that are implementing some of these requirements now, working with some software vendors there, but also been actively involved in providing guidance and support for a number of drug serialisation programs with some pharmaceutical customers. So hopefully today we'll be sharing some practical experience, help you think about what needs to be done as you're moving towards serialisation. Some logistics before we start. If you'd like to ask a question today, you should find a Q&A button on your screen. If you just press that, you can then type in your question. That'll pop up at this end. We'll either answer your question verbally during the webcast, or we might post a written answer, which everybody can see. Sometimes we don't get time to answer all the questions, especially if some come in towards the end. And if that's the case, we'll be discussing them following up in our blog, and you can see the URL link to the website there where we post the blogs. If you do have any technical problems today, hopefully you won't, but if you do, you can use the chat facility. We have Helen online ready to help answer any questions that you might have with the user interface or the technology, but it is worth saying before we start, very often one of the first things to look at is network connectivity, especially if you're receiving audio over your laptop or computer rather than audio. Okay, so let's get into today's topic, shall we? You can see we're going to cover a number of areas today. I wasn't initially intending to cover the current regulatory position in a lot of detail. I was involved with the webcast last week with Virginia Herald from the California State Board of Pharmacy, where we did cover the current regulatory position. Unfortunately, the recording for that, which was on somebody else's platform, I should point out, the recording for that actually doesn't actually have the audio, which isn't very useful. So we will start by running through the current regulatory position, but that will be relatively quickly. We'll look at some of the business benefits from serialisation as well. Very often we look at it as a cost, something we have to do from a regulatory perspective, but there are potential business benefits as well which come from serialisation. We'll look then at some typical serialisation projects and some of the challenges that have been faced, and a lot of those, as we'll hear, come from scaling up some of the pilots projects which a number of companies have undertaken. We'll look at the use of serial numbers in the supply chain and how that can impact upon a number of business processes, some of which you'll obviously be aware of, some which you might not have thought of. And then we'll look at the increasing need for systems integration as regulators are giving us more and more practical information on how this is all supposed to work. And we'll wrap up with some conclusions and questions and answers. So let's start with a quick overview of current requirements for serialisation. Some of this you'll be already aware of, I'm sure. Some of it, the updates, will be relatively new. The current requirements for serialisation, we've put that in quotes there because actually not all of these require serialisation. But certainly France, Belgium and Turkey have existing requirements. France isn't true serialisation. That's because we're only required to uniquely identify when we're packaging a particular lot of pharmaceuticals. So we're not applying individual serial numbers to individual items there. The same number will be applied to the whole lot as it's packaged. That's using 2D data matrix and it's currently being enforced now. It's been in place for a couple of years, and most organisations obviously selling into France are complying that. Belgium even precedes that. Use of a single or 2D barcode, sequential numbering, again, been up there for a while, and most organisations have no problems complying with that. Turkey is more recent. Turkey was interesting because it really started along the road of adopting some of the data standards that are coming from the commercial world. They're using the Global Trade Identification Numbers, GTINs. So for those of you perhaps over the counter manufacturers, you'll be very well aware of GTINs that are sold through retail pharmacies, for instance, on products. Again, using a 2D data matrix, which allows us to put more information into a smaller footprint on the packaging. But as we'll talk about it later, Turkey doesn't actually require randomization of cereals. And the reason for that is because Turkey wanted to look at issues around reimbursement fraud, i.e. the government paying for product multiple times, which was getting relatively expensive. So that wasn't really to address patient safety issues, that really was a reimbursement issue. The other thing Turkey also brought in, not successfully the first time round, but was the requirement for data to be recorded at various stages through the supply chain, but also to be submitted to a central repository maintained by their Ministry of Health. And one of the things that they learned from that was, we're talking about large data sets here, which we'll talk about in a little while. I think it's true to say that when they first went live, things were a little bit overwhelming for them. That's the current state of play, and as we'll see, there's a number of requirements coming along. Last week, Virginia Herald from the California State Board of Pharmacy gave us a good update of their current process. So over in California, if you are selling into the US or selling into California, you will need to use serialized unique identifiers down at the item level. And the requirement there is to have 50% of your items serialized with e-pedigrees and to be able to report on that on January the 1st, 2015. So that's a requirement that's coming along for next year. To be reported, as I say, at the beginning of the following year. And the current regulation also addresses the issue of grandfathering, which is essentially non-serialized product that you would already have in the supply chain when the regulation comes into effect. That's not a problem, but you do need to be able to report on that. One of the good things that they've been doing in California, a very good public consultation process, and they've been looking at some of the real supply chain issues. How is this going to work in practice? And we'll talk about some of those in a moment. But that is very important. It's relatively easy for regulators to make demands for serialization, to protect patient safety and so on, but this has to work in practice. And as California have been, first to get their legislation ready to go, they've been having to tackle a lot of really practical issues, and there's been some good public dialogue around that. California will require the use of an SNI, serialized numeric identifier. That's adopting the US FDA's guidelines. FDA published a guideline document on the use of SNIs a couple of years ago now. And the data that will need to be encoded in that is the US National Drug Code, the NDC, plus a 20-digit alphanumeric number, which is the serialized number. And then that information will need to be aggregated up into the e-pedigree, which is exchanged down through the distribution chain. The latest part of that regulation, 1747.1, does require this list of serialized products to be submitted by the end of next year. Somebody, a senior position in the company, has to submit that and bind the company to that commitment. And you'll have to provide a list of what products have been serialized, how you've calculated that 50% of your supply has been serialized. That can be by breakdown of stock keeping units, unit volumes, drug product families, therapeutic areas, and so on. You'd also need to provide a list and a quantity of drugs that have not been serialized. Interestingly, you'll have to give a statement describing what technology you're using to achieve that serialization, and that includes the platform, who the software vendor is, the hardware, communications technology, and so on. So a lot of information will need to be provided there. And then 12 months later, you'll have to essentially provide the same information saying how you've serialised and put into pedigrees. The other 50%, sorry, you spotted the typo there. That should be 50%, not 5, which is due by the end of 2015. So these deadlines are coming along, and as we mentioned earlier, California is really looking at this in a very practical way. One of the issues they're currently looking at is drop shipments. I think it's true to say that a lot of what we take as good distribution practice regulations or guidelines were written at a time when our supply and distribution chains were very different to they are now. Drop shipment is very common these days, where essentially a manufacturer is sending the product directly to a pharmacy, but the chain of custody, the ownership of that product might change several times, and people who legally own the product might never actually see it or touch it. In those circumstances, hello again, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me again now. Apologies for that. Telephone line dropped. These things happen. Right, let's try and pick up where we were. We were talking about, well, I'll start on drop shipments again. We're talking about drop shipments, which is manufacturers sending products directly to the pharmacy regardless of the chain of custody, i.e. legal ownership. California will allow the e-pedigree to be sent directly from the manufacturers to the pharmacy. And again, that obviously makes things a lot easier. It does match the real, the product in movement. More complicated and being debated quite vocally is the issue of inference, which is essentially the ability to pack a number of items into a case or a carton, and then through the supply chain to infer what is in that carton based upon scanning the unique identifier of the case or carton, and based upon a record which keeps track of which individual items have gone into that case or carton. California is moving to a ruling where basically they will allow wholesalers and distributors to infer the contents of a case or carton as long as they've received an e-pedigree in advance, and as long as the case or carton has been not tampered with. The big question there is what's going to happen when that gets opened. The State Board of Pharmacy would like every item to be scanned individually as soon as that case or carton is opened, and for pedigrees to be updated. Distributors and wholesalers in California aren't keen to do that because it will require more work, obviously. Now, if you're not selling to California, this might seem a bit esoteric, but the reality is most companies selling into the US or within the US are not able to determine at the time they're packaging products where it's going to go to. So if these California regulations come into effect, essentially you may end up having to serialise and develop pedigrees for all products sold into or within the US. So quite a big consideration there. Now, I said if these things come into effect, the situation with the US is at the federal level, the government are finally starting to act upon this. The State Board of California did put a proviso into their regulations that if the US federal government acted on the issue of counterfeit drugs and falsification and implemented laws or enacted a law prior to the California deadline coming into effect, then essentially the California deadline would not come into effect and would be superseded by the federal regulations. So at the moment, the federal regulation are working on a bipartisan, bicameral bill. That means it's got support in all houses and across parties. So they have a draft bill to look at the issues of pharmaceutical theft, counterfeiting, and so on. And if that's enacted, that will actually give us something like an additional 4 years to start to serialise drug products. But within 10 years, quite a long time, we would have to have fully electronic and interoperable unit-level traceability for all of our products. So quite a stretch to achieve that, but quite a long time period. Now, there are a lot of practical issues that need to be addressed with any federal regulations. They've not had time at the federal level to really talk about some of the practical implications that California or even that Europe has consulted on. So big issues there. Genuinely, we do not know what the details of that final regulation will be or the final act will be, and we don't know yet when it's going to be enacted. There is ongoing progress on that. But literally day by day, we are trying to keep our eyes open for when these bills are being discussed and when they're likely to be pushed through. So those of you selling to California or the US, certainly something to keep an eye on. Things could happen as quickly as next year if the federal government doesn't get their act together in time. But equally, if they do get something in place which essentially suspends the California requirements, then we will have more time to act for the US, which will be good because there will be a number of issues to sort out there. There are, however, plenty of other requirements coming along which I'll run through quickly. A lot of these have been proposed at a relatively high level. Again, a lot of details to be worked out. So South Korea is looking to have 50% of domestically manufactured or imported products serialised by the end of 2015. They've moved down towards the use of GS1 data standard, which is certainly the most widely adopted standard for serialisation in the industry. Again, using the global 13-digit global trade identification number, or something called GS1 128, which is a 128-digit identifier, and that tends to be used more for blood and biologics, for instance. They're going to require serialisation at the primary and secondary level. That means down at the individual bottle or package, but also then on on the next level of packaging, whether you call that a case or an outer, they're going to require traceability at that level as well. In India, it's a slightly different situation. India is actually requiring serialisation on products that are not imported into the country, but exported from the country. So if you're not actually manufacturing in India, then this really isn't of concern to you. And the reason that the Indian government have addressed this, they've wanted to do something about the perception or perhaps the reality of drug counterfeiting coming out of the Indian market. So anything that's being exported from India will require the use of GS1 standards, again 2D data matrix on the primary packaging, one-dimensional or 2D, so that should be GTIN on the secondary packaging, but also the use of GTINs on tertiary packaging as well. And we need to have this hierarchical construction of data as well, so we know which primary units went into the secondary packaging and so on. It's going to require organisation to keep export records to be maintained for a minimum of 6 months after the expiry date. Those requirements were due to come into effect this year, but Indian manufacturers really pushed back against that deadline because they realised it just wasn't practical. The legislation was really brought in for political reasons, and there was no way all of the Indian drug manufacturers could meet the 2013 deadline. So that's been pushed out now to July 2014. At the moment, we have no idea when or if India will require for serialisation for products which are sold into that country or manufactured domestically for sale in the country. Pressing on with our quick tour of the world, Argentina have also produced some regulations. Again, they're going to require a unique identifier, which will include batch number and expiry date. Again, that's going to use the GS1 standard. There are specific requirements for agents in the distribution chain to record logistical movements and also to transmit that data to the regulator in what they currently are calling real time. We don't have a definition of what real time is, whether that's seconds, hours or days, but clearly they're not looking for people to aggregate and consolidate this data and submit it over a period of months. They're going to roll these requirements out successively. They're going to look at high-risk classes of drug products first, which is a common theme across a number of industries. And one of the things all companies need to do is really understand where serialisation and pedigree requirements apply to their own products and at which date those regulations will apply to their particular classes of products. It's obviously going to be quite a complex picture with respect to different types of drugs in different markets. And if you're a large organisation, you really need to plan that out and understand which requirements in which markets are going to get you time. If we just pop next door, and what we can see is Brazil also has some requirements. They've got at this moment draft proposals for a national system of drug control. Again, they're going to have primary and secondary level serialisation, 2D data matrix. They're going to require you to put their unique 13-digit drug registration number as well as unique randomised serial number, lot number and expiration date. So as we're seeing, although some of the data standards that are being adopted are common across different markets, what data you actually encode using that standard is going to be different from market to market. Brazil also requires tracing and capture of product movements from the point of manufacture right through to dispensing at the pharmacy, including the ability to track so-called reverse logistics, so returns back up the supply chain. And again, they're going to require manufacturers, but also distributors and pharmacies to maintain this IUN number, this unique identification of medicines, and the so-called CNPJ data, which is data about your supply chain partners, but also to supply that information to them as well. It is a draft proposal. Again, technical details need to be worked out, but they have said that after the final proposal is published, there is only a 180-day implementation deadline. That really is something to watch. 6 months sounds like a long time, but to meet the specific requirements in a specific market, you need to have a solution ready in place to be able to encode the information in the relevant standard, obviously to pass that information down to packaging lines, and potentially then supply that to the Brazilian regulators. China is a very interesting one as well. China is taking drug safety more seriously. I've been out there quite a bit the last few years. Last year they brought out a version of what they call their National Essential Drug Lists, which started off with about 500 drug molecules, something like 300 products with something about 850 formulations. That list has been growing over the last few years. This year they've published some new good distribution practice rules which come into effect for domestic manufacture, and next year overseas manufacturers, i.e. companies selling into China from outside, are required to meet those requirements. So if you are selling product into China, that is a hard and fast requirement for products on that National Essential Drug List. And in 2015 it will apply to all products, and although there will be a period of grace, we do expect to have enforcement in place by 2016. 2016 is a date that pops up quite a lot. It sounds like it's a long way away, but in reality we're talking about 26 months. And as we'll see later, that if you've not started looking at some of these things, that time can pass very quickly. China are doing their own thing. They are going to be issuing their own electronic drug monitoring codes. And when we say they will be issuing those codes to manufacturers, that means you will not be generating your own serial numbers for China. You will be given the serial numbers which you have to apply to your products. You will have to then provide that information to the Chinese authorities using their China Drug Identification, Authentication and Tracking System, which is part of a wider product tracking portal which they're putting in place. You're probably all aware China has had a reputation for counterfeiting, not just in the drug area, so they're putting a system in place to be able to track not just drugs but a wider range of products as well. So they are not adopting the GS1 standards, they're not going down the global trade identification number route. So for China you will have to maintain the format and the serial numbers that are issued by the authorities and be able to provide those back to them as well. Closer to home for many of us, here in the European Union, of course, we've had the Falsified Medicines Directive, which was enacted back in 2011. Like most of these regulations, it doesn't actually say a lot. You can see there Article 54 has a clause added, Clause O. I won't read it all out to you, you can read that, but in green you can see it just has a requirement that we have to be able to identify individual packs. Very easy to say that, as we'll see it's quite a different thing to be able to comply with that. The Falsified Medicines Directive also has a much broader remit in looking at security of the supply chain and looking at counterfeiting. So it is looking at anti-tampering devices being applied to packaging, as well as changes in regulations and control and distributors, which will be coming into effect over the next few years. That EU directive has largely been implemented into national law now across the EU. Those have to be adopted into national law to be enforced. And next year there's a requirement for the Commission to develop some so-called delegated acts. What those will do, they will actually define two things. First of all, they will come up with the list of drug products that will have to be serialised. Generally, if it is an ethical prescription drug, it will need to be serialised, but if it's an over-the-counter medication, it won't be. But it is expected there will be some exceptions, some risk-based exceptions to that. So we expect to see those lists published next year. But we also expect some of the technical details of how these systems are going to work, what standards will be used, and so on, will be enacted in the delegated acts. 2016 is again the deadline for compliance, which is 3 years after it was implemented into national law. again, that's really going to give us somewhere between 12 and probably 18 months to implement our systems and processes for Europe before we have to comply. It's achievable, but there's not going to be a lot of slack in those time frames. As part of that, the Commission is required to look at cost effectiveness, costs and benefits through the way of a study. So as part of these delegated acts next year, they have to look at the technical options for what the unique identifier will have to be. Again, 2D data matrix using GS1 is probably the most likely candidate there. Certainly industry comment last year was leading that way. So going down the same route as Turkey, as some of the South American and US markets are going. They're also required to look at what's called the extent and modalities of the verification and authenticity methods. Bit of a mouthful. Really, that's just asking the question, how is this going to work in practice in the supply chain? And they are required to look at different supply chain models in all of the member states. So we talked earlier about the way California's been discussing drop shipments. So we have to think about all of that, how that works within Europe, but also for products being imported into Europe and then transshipped across the European Union. So they have to think about how that's going to work. And they also have to look at what the technical options are and how they're going to manage the repository where we will be required to send our serialised information. That's something which is called the European Medicines Verification System. They've actually already announced that that's going to be based upon Microsoft Azure, so it's going to be up in the cloud, so we know where it's going to be hosted, but we don't know exactly what the technical details are. We will be seeing more of that information coming out next year. So things are obviously moving on. To try and pull all that together, there are deadlines which start next year, certainly if you're selling into China. So between 2014 and 2016, deadlines will be coming on thick and fast. Generally, regulators are looking to adopt commercial standards. GS1, 2D data matrix is I think, the most common there. But as we've already discussed, even if we're using a common data carrier, the data that we have to encode as part of the number to go on the items is going to be different. So the US is the national drug code, China's issuing their own numbers and so on. And China is not adopting GS1. Different markets have requirements for serialisation at different levels. Some are only looking at primary and secondary levels of packaging. Some are requiring tertiary levels of packaging as well. So there are going to be varied requirements to manage and maintain this data. And as we said, in the case of China, you'll actually have to receive your serial numbers from the state FDA. For a lot of organisations who are selling into China from outside the country, essentially it's most likely that your agent in China will receive those serials and will then have to pass them on to you for use in packaging. And there are different requirements in different markets to be able to maintain your own databases of serial numbers and or pedigree, but also to submit some of that data to central databases. So there are requirements which the FDA have to think about in the US, which California have already thought about, that are applicable in South America. We've just talked about the European system. You're going to have to continue providing information to Turkey, China, and so on. A lot of information flying around. So it's complex. It's going to require some investment. One of the things we have to try and do is justify that investment. And think about some of the business benefits. Now, depending on your organisation and how much of a problem you have with counterfeiting, there are opportunities to potentially reduce costs and possibly increase revenues or margins. Being able to track product at a much more granular level allows us to do things in the supply chain that we can't do currently. We can potentially fulfil our customers' orders more accurately. We can keep track of what was actually sent to them and received, much more level of detail. Serialisation will allow us to identify where parallel imports, for instance, are coming into certain markets. Certainly in Europe, we know that the price you get for a drug is different in different countries, But if companies are shipping products across borders where it's more profitable to sell that product, that's something potentially that you want to detect, and if you can, to prevent that, because that's eroding market share and eroding margins as well. In a lot of instances, counterfeit product is actually introduced into the supply chain through false returns. So there are stories of counterfeit product being received back by a pharmaceutical company, that's then sent off to for destruction by a third party, but instead of being destroyed, it ends up coming back again as another return and for another reimbursement. Obviously, if you can identify stock by use of serialised code, you can identify where you're seeing things for that second time, but also you can genuinely know, is it a real product that we manufactured? Does the serial number correspond with the batch number, for instance? And that allows you to only reimburse for genuine stock. You'll be able to track your effectiveness of your sales campaigns. You'll be able to identify for the first time actually which product is going out through which pharmacies potentially. So you can understand if you've been running sales campaigns in specific markets, specific regions, you can see if they're effective by looking at what formulations, for instance, are being taken through the pharmacies. To limit the scope of recalls, so if you've got a potential problem because of a storage issue, for instance, in your supply chain, rather than recalling the whole batch, you would just be able to recall by serial number. So we can do more targeted recalls, obviously a lower cost there. You can hopefully better control leakage. That's a nice word for theft. Pharmaceuticals are targeted by criminal gangs. They're relatively low volume, high value products. And more for organisations involved perhaps in pharmacotherapeutics with devices, you can keep track of demonstration stock or on a pharma side on physician samples, for instance. There are things you can do with serialisation that you can't do without. What that allows you to do is some value mapping to try and understand what some of these cost savings are potentially worth, what some of these potential revenue enhancements are worth. To do that, your various organisational stakeholders need to give you an idea of what these incremental cost savings are in the short term to a long term and so on. And you can see here that some potential areas where you can get additional value coming out of manufacturing operations through better sales revenues, through pricing, preventing theft, and so on. So the idea is that looking in these different areas, you can look at potential cost savings and revenue enhancement opportunities to try and identify where serialisation is of business benefit and use that to put together a case for a good serialisation process and solution, other than one that just meets the minimal regulatory requirements. As we'll see in a moment, just meeting the regulatory requirements might keep you in the good books as far as the regulator is concerned, but it's going to be costly unless you implement it in an efficient way. So let's look at some of the problems that organisations have been facing implementing serialisation projects. Only about a fifth of pharmaceutical companies have actually implemented a pilot project. A number of those have reported those as being successful, but what they're seeing now, as they're looking at a broader set of markets and more products, is that their pilot solutions aren't scaling up. And there's a number of reasons for that. Part of that is because the pilot projects only looked at a limited set of business processes for a relatively small number of markets. So typically pilots would look at a small number of products being sold to Turkey, for instance. And the focus was very much just on, can we apply cereals to our labelling and packaging, and can we ship them out into the supply chain? And more latterly for Turkey, can we provide that information to the Ministry of Health? But in some cases it didn't include true serialisation or randomisation. So if you look at going from the French model, where you can apply a single identifier to a whole lot of product, which could be 20,000, could be 50,000 items, when you have to label each one of those items individually and assign a serial number with various statuses, has the serial number been been commissioned, decommissioned, what has it been shipped, link all that to information such as lot number, expiry date, manufacturing plant, and so on. We're talking about very large data sets. When you start to randomize that, the ability to generate tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of serial numbers with true randomization is quite a challenging technological issue. And people are finding that the systems they put in place on pilot projects are struggling to cope with that. And very often these pilot systems were very much standalone. They weren't integrated. They were using people to transfer data from one system to the other. And there's no way that that can be sustained in full-scale operations. So really, most of these pilot projects didn't address the issues of integrating systems. So the optimistic view coming out of serialization projects from these pilots was very much the requirements focus on some of the technical requirements, the data standards, the ability to print and verify serials, obviously set up the configuration of the systems, your serial management system, your packaging line, with a limited number of packaging lines and markets. But a more realistic view is that we have to look at the re-engineering of our business processes to use serial numbers. That has to be a key part of capturing the requirements. As we'll see, that's very complex. We have to also look during implementation, not just the configuration of the system, but the integration of the systems. Our experience is that system configuration is relatively simple. You know, if you look at overall project timescales, configuring the system is 20% of the duration of the project. Your business process re-engineering and your system integration is probably the other 80%. Very important for it to work efficiently and effectively though. And rather than having one regulatory deadline to look at, you're going to have to look at multiple deadlines for different products in different markets. So you may have to go around this implementation loop several times to get ready for China, and then the European Union, and then Argentina, and the US, and so on. Now, you might choose to wrap all of those requirements up in one big bang, but the reality is we won't have the US federal requirements, and we won't have the details of the European Union requirements while we need to be implementing for China. So you're going to have to go through several phases of implementation, and for each one, you're going to have to look at different system integration requirements. So if we look at some of those business issues, the real requirements are, of course, technical, but we have to think about the changes to our supply chain. We need to look at how that impacts upon our packaging operations, our inventory management and distribution. That much is obvious. But we also need to think about recalls, we need to think about returns, we even need to think about some of the things around our pricing processes as well. And that might not be obvious at first glance, but there are more areas in your supply chain that are either impacted by the use of serialized products or where the use of serialization gives you business opportunities than you might think if you're just thinking about purely the regulatory requirements. You can see the bottom of the screen there. I won't expect you to read the detail, but essentially a before and after business process map. Before serialization, after serialization. It looks at first glance that we've just added a couple of steps in the process down the bottom left after serialization. But actually when we looked at the differences of the business processes for serialized versus non-serialized products, yes, we required a couple of additional steps in the process, but there were actually significant changes for some organisations in terms of where packaging operations were taking place, which packaging lines were going to handle serialized product and which ones weren't. And in some cases, this does require some significant changes to your business processes. You might need to think about how and where you're going to package and label. You might not want to invest in serializing product on every packaging line, for instance, if only 50% of your products need to be serialized for certain markets. So you need to choose on which lines you're going to implement serialization. It might be that you might choose to move your contract manufacturing or contract packaging, extend the scope of that number of contract manufacturers and contract packaging organisations are getting ready to support serialisation, one of the things that you can do to defer some of the cost of serialisation is stop packaging product yourself. That means you won't need to apply the serial numbers and invest in upgrading your packaging lines. You might bring out a contract manufacturer instead. But equally, if you're working with a contract manufacturer now who is not going to be ready for the serialisation deadlines, you either need to find another contractor or you might need to bring it back in-house. We talked about recalls. You need to think about your recall process, how you limit the scope of that using serial numbers. You need to look at how you accept returns. And it might be that you look on changes to your terms and conditions and pricing based upon the fact that you're going to have a more accurate view of actually who is placing orders for product, which you should know, but actually who's prescribing product as well, because you'll be able to track things hopefully more accurately through the pharmacies in some cases. So in some cases there are going to be significant changes to your supply chain operations. You need to map those out, how they're going to change over time for different markets before you actually start thinking about how your systems need to be configured. Experience is that most pilot projects didn't really look at the whole end-to-end supply chain, didn't really look at issues like how inference would be handled, how drop shipments would be supported and so on. So you need to think about that. We're finding now as people are starting to think about that this modelling takes longer than was estimated or planned. But if you don't do that, you end up in a lot of rework on projects. So you end up having to reconfigure your system or customise your system. And as the regulatory requirements have been better defined, have some of the technical requirements been better defined, we're actually seeing a shakeout with some of the software vendors. They've actually realised that their products don't scale, aren't capable of meeting some of the requirements. So we're seeing the number of suppliers to the market is actually reducing. A lot of smaller companies brought out e-pedigree or serialisation products with a very simple view of what that entailed. But when you look at it across the whole supply chain, it's obviously much more complex. And you need to look at the requirements for systems integration as well. That's very important. I'm certainly aware of one organisation when they put their pilot in place, they chose not to integrate, as one simple example, their serial management solution with their ERP system. And they were a very low volume manufacturer. They were producing, batches which were, less than 10 batches a year, orphan drugs. And the users, what they told them was that it was very time consuming to be able to, manage the generation of all these serial numbers, moving the data from one system to the other manually. And when you scale that up to much larger organisations, to multiple markets, that becomes unsustainable. You really need to integrate your systems for this to work without a lot of manual rekeying of information, which is an obvious source of error. In the middle there, where you can see the little number 2, we've assumed that an organisation has a serial management solution. And what we're doing here is looking at all the interfaces a system like that might have. So coming in from the left where it says number 1, we might have serial numbers which are generated externally. They might in theory come from your ERP system. Certainly if you're selling to China, those will be the numbers supplied by the state FDA in China. It's worth mentioning that generating serial numbers within your ERP system. If you're talking low volumes, most ERP systems can handle serialized product. If you're talking about generating randomized serial numbers, which are numbering tens or hundreds of thousands, that's going to have a serious adverse impact on most ERP systems. So if you're looking at high volume, generating serial numbers within your ERP system, probably not the way to go. But for some organisations, it might be the source of the serial numbers, or they might come from the regulators. Or you can generate the serial numbers, as number 2 shows us, within the serial management solution. We're then going to get typically a request from a packaging line. You might have not just more than one packaging line, you might have multiple sites with multiple packaging lines. You're going to request from a packaging line which basically says, we now need to package against this works order, we need to package up to 30,000 units of this particular SKU. Please can you pass down the serial numbers that we can use? Or it might be that the serial numbers are actually generated by the packaging line. That's also a possibility. The serial numbers would be passed down then from the serial management solution. That's number 4. On the packaging line, typically you will verify which serial numbers have been used, because they won't all actually be used. If you get a problem with your printing and you have to throw away some packs, those serial numbers are not valid. They cannot go into the supply chain. You have to tell your repository that those serial numbers have not been commissioned and they should not appear in your supply and distribution chain. You can then see we have 6 is the data going out from the serialisation solution. That might be to Turkish Ministry of Health, it might be the European system, it might be going back out to the SFDA in China. Again, they're going to require different data in different formats. But of course, the other thing that you're going to do is want to be able to push this information possibly to your downstream trading partners. And if the e-pedigree hits the streets in the US the way it's the California looking at the moment, you will certainly need to be able to publish e-pedigrees and make those available to distributors. And again, there's going to be information coming with product coming back up the supply chain in terms of returns and recalls. So a lot of requirements for passing data amongst systems here, a lot of requirements for system integration, which is why, as I said earlier, actually configuring the system in the middle doesn't take too long if you understand the business processes, but then you have to integrate it for efficiency and for it to work automatically. And again, it gets much more complicated where you have multiple packaging lines. You've got 3 packaging lines on a site. You need to generate a works order from your ERP system to say which line you're going to package, how much of a particular formulation and a particular SKU from a particular manufacturing batch. That needs to be sent down to the appropriate label printing system on the packaging line, needs to be verified by your vision systems, come back up to your serial management solution as well. So all of this is quite complicated. And wherever you've got an external system, a printer, a label checking system and so on, as part of this business process mapping, you need to identify what data is required, and that's going to depend on which market the product's going to, because the data requirements are different. You need to know at which stage in the business process the data is required, because the last thing you want is for a packaging line to be standing idle because you haven't received the serial numbers to package against. That's something you need to think about when you think about where you generate the serial numbers. Obviously, you need to think about where data is coming back from the packaging line, back from a supply chain partner and so on, and then what information you need to pass out. So, very complicated. Certainly the modelling we've done shows that we're talking about multiple interfaces on those systems, and again, that's time consuming. One of the things that you need to look at when looking at serialisation is how you're going to develop these interfaces. We are starting to understand what the data requirements are and what the data standards look like out in the supply chain. But if we're going to develop, traditional point-to-point interfaces between these different systems, it's going to be inefficient, it's going to be slow, it might put our projects at risk of meeting regulatory timescales. And the problem is, if you develop traditional point-to-point interfaces, as soon as you change one version of software in one of the systems, you're into revalidating all the interfaces again, time-consuming. So the key thing to look for there when you're looking at integrating serialization systems is the use of service-oriented architecture and web services. That allows you to reuse software much more efficiently. It allows you to develop different data models and interchange data between systems much more effectively. And most good systems now will support open standards. Again, experience here is that can cut the time required to develop these interfaces in half. And a lot of the vendors do have standard interfaces already pre-programmed where they know, what data needs to be interchanged so wrap up, and then we'll see if we've got any questions. The regulatory requirements are being clarified. There is some standardisation, but as we saw, that's not universal. There are multiple data models which are being required by regulators, and our business processes must be capable of supporting those different data models internationally. So if you're an international organisation, you're selling overseas, you need to look at how a system can support all of those. Experience is showing that it's taking longer to implement and integrate serialisation solutions than most organisations thought. And a few people in the industry now are starting to talk about a Y2K type crunch on resources. Effectively, 2014, 2015 is when all of this needs to happen. And just as we were, running short of people to address all of our Y2K issues, there are concerns that the software vendors out there will have limited capability to support projects. And one of the most challenging things is we can't wait until all of the regulatory requirements are defined before we do something for the first markets. So it looks like certainly China, certainly the EU, we know what the deadlines are there. We have to start thinking about what we do for China now, even as the EU are defining their technical requirements. And the key thing is we have to pick flexible, scalable, and easily integrated solutions that will be able to meet our immediate requirements for China, for instance, or potentially for California. But we have to choose products that have the flexibility so that whatever the US federal government might come up with, or whatever Argentina or Brazil define technically, that our systems are capable of meeting that. What that means is you need a system that has broad capability and flexibility. It might not be the cheapest system to implement at the beginning, and you need to look at your business case to help justify that investment. But overall, that flexibility, as you're going through these multiple iterations to meet new data requirements for new markets, investing in a flexible system that has that capability will do away with this requirement for reworking, and in some cases we're seeing people throwing away the systems that they used on their pilot projects, for instance. Okay, so we've got a few minutes for some questions. Before I look at those, just to mention, next month we're going to have a webcast where we'll actually be looking at some of the GMP and GDP updates that are coming out of the UK Medicine and Healthcare Regulatory Products Agency, MHRA. They've got some conferences at the beginning of December, so they're going to be covering some more requirements for the Falsified Medicines Directive. We'll be looking at that in a webcast in December, and in January we're going to be looking at digital signatures. Right, we've got a couple of questions. Right, okay. First question we've got is what's the typical time to implement a serialisation solution? It's obviously variable. It really does depend on how many markets you're looking to meet the requirements for. Typically, when we look at what it takes to, define the business processes, meet the, specific requirements for a specific market, configure the system and roll it out, typically, and integrate that into the supply chain, you're probably looking at a 6 to 9 month timescale for your initial rollout. If you pick the right system, rolling out to additional markets with specific requirements is obviously going to be shorter than that. You'll have to go through some more requirements gathering and some reconfiguration and integration with the market-specific systems. So typically a new market, you're going to need to plan probably 3 to 6 months for subsequent rollouts. So a couple of questions. Do we have any update on the status of the delegated acts and the most likely contents? We don't really know the dates. Rumour in industry is that we're likely to see it in the first half of next year, which will be good. The sooner the better. Likely contents, I think we're already seeing that the EU has learned lessons from Turkey, both in terms of the standards they want to implement. So yes, looks most likely it's going to be GS1 as the data carrier. It looks as if they're going to be using things like GTINs because those go well, in the retail supply chain as well. There's minimal investment there for pharmacies who can already read GTINs, for instance. We don't think they're going to be prescriptive in terms of whether it's 2D data matrix. Most likely they're going to leave the manufacturers to determine that. And that's largely going to depend, I think, on how much footprint you have on your packaging. In some cases you can carry on using traditional 1D barcoding, which may not require updates to your packaging lines, but in some cases you're going to need to use 2D to be able to compress the information to the space available, and you might need to look at new printers, new software and so on. But I think that's the most likely vision there. Next one, will the European Commission publish their impact assessment? Yes, I mean they're really required to share this information, and to be fair to them, through last year, the public consultation process that took place in Europe was very open. Clearly people need to be watching the various websites for those pronouncements. And again, when that information comes out, typically it is available through the national regulators' websites. So here in the UK, MHRA, anything like that comes out, there is an announcement from MHRA. You can get on their emailing lists for updates, for instance. One final question. When will the US federal government come out with their final regulations? Well, we've been saying any day now for the last several weeks. It literally could be any day now. It could be weeks or months still. And even that is going to be very high-level legislation. There is still a lot of detail that they need to work out. And one of the biggest issues in the US is going to be who pays for the infrastructure. In Turkey, the Ministry of Health pay to maintain their database. And one of the things that FDA has said previously is this will only work properly at a federal level in the US. It will need a national database rather than, at one stage they would propose us to have rival databases, and you could choose which database you subscribe to, based upon which was the lowest cost. FDA have said it makes sense to have a single database at the federal level, but they will probably look to put up licensing costs to be able to cover the cost of that. A lot of detail to work out, and the big question there is really whether they get their act together in time to cut off the California requirements, or whether California goes live with their requirements. Talking with Virginia last week, I mean, the California State Board of Pharmacy are not holding back on the expectation the federal government will meet the deadlines. They are moving forward on the basis that they will implement e-pedigree against their deadlines, because that's something they are now required to do. Thank you very much for your time. I think we've just about got all the questions covered, which was great. Apologies for the technical details. Please do keep an eye on our blogs, because we will be talking about this in future weeks, and obviously as updates are coming out of the US and updates are coming out of the EU, we will be talking about that on our blogs. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll have a chance to join us again next month when we'll look at some of these GMP and GDP updates.